right, so we're learning about the Battle of Mossy Creek.
Battle of Mossy Creek happened in 1863, December 29th. It started at about 9 o'clock in the morning, went all the way to 6 o'clock at night. It was the Union Army was a lot of the army that was left over from the army that had defended Knoxville, but it was also part of what would become Sherman's army that marched to the sea in the 1860s. The Confederate army that was here was Longstreet's army, and it was his cavalry, and then Longstreet had laid siege to Knoxville, wasn't successful, and then was retreating towards Virginia, but was supposed to stay in East Tennessee to keep the Union Army occupied and make sure it didn't go into southwestern Virginia. So Longstreet stayed basically in Morristown. The Union Army moved to Mossy Creek, and this was the line. And so the Confederate cavalry pushed into Mossy Creek. They get to Mossy Creek, and there's an engagement, and it's up where Glenmore was, and over there's like a little league field over here, and there's Eli Lilly led the artillery brigade. Eli Lilly is famous because Eli Lilly's corporation is one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, and he fought at the Battle of Mossy Creek and was actually the Union hero with his field artillery, stopped the Southern charge.
Wow.
And so we have, so that's where they fought. We know that on the side of the hill here, and right where we walk over here, were two Union camps. It's at one point or another there were two camps in the Union Army, and they fought. They stayed here at one point, one to guard the bridge right here, and then two they stayed up there on the hill because this was all farm field, and so that they fought right there.
All right, we're here with David Neitz again, July 12th, 2017, and I asked him to explain a little bit about who fought for the South and who fought for the Union around Jefferson City / Mossy Creek.
A lot of the people that fought for the South here were people that had a stake in a new government. So they tended to be landowners. They tended to be people that were a lot of the local politicians were pro-Confederate. The college people were Confederate. They believed strongly in the principle of states' rights, and so states' rights to them was important because they didn't want interference from the federal government. So anybody that owned land, and significant part of land, was certainly pro-Confederate or pro-South. Anybody that had a stake in that. In fact, you look at some of the contemporary accounts of the Democrat platform for Jefferson County in 1860, and it was condemning of John Brown. It was condemning abolitionism and condemning federal interference. And so a lot of the people that were here were certainly pro-Confederate, which led John Branner in an interesting situation because he ran the railroad through all of East Tennessee, and most of East Tennessee, or parts of East Tennessee, stayed pro-Union. So he had to walk that delicate balance of being both Confederate and so because this area changed hands at least 10 times, we know of for certain, where it was either North controlled or South controlled. A lot of there was sheer desolation all through this. All that they talk about in 1864 when they walked through the Union soldiers, that there was just burnout chimneys of where houses used to be, that there was nothing left. Because even during the Civil War at the Battle of Mossy Creek, it was so cold the day after that Union soldiers burnt houses to stay warm, and just because there was nothing left. There was no firewood, or it was so cold they couldn't get to it. And so that changed. They talk about that a lot of the people that fought for the Union were such because there was the people that were pro-South in here were so they would just go into people's homes and take their weapons and interfere with their homes because they were afraid that they may be Union men. And Jefferson County was a county that was split down the middle, that they were so afraid of that they would just go into their homes when they had the backing of the Confederate government, and it would just raid their houses. And so there were no churches open in 1862 to 65 because if you went to church and you had a horse, it was likely that it would be taken by one side or the other, whoever was in the area.
Wow.
And so that there was nothing, people just stayed at home, and you didn't even really work your farm, because if you worked your farm, people were going to come and take, both sides were going to come and take it. So there was no, there was no staying neutral during this. And so for the citizens of this area, including the Peck family. There's an account in the Union battle orders. General Sturgis stayed at Dr. Peck's house. His headquarters was Dr. Peck's house over there on the road. Have you showed him Dr. Peck's house?
That's next.
The General Sturgis was in charge of the whole Union Army here. Sturgis fought for basically in Sherman's army, and he stayed. His headquarters was the Dr. Peck's house.
Wow.
During that, and so that was their place of operation as they went through. And so it tells stories about how the Peck family, he stayed at Dr. Peck's house. Well, we don't think Dr. Peck was in the pro-union cause, but he didn't have a choice.
Wow.
He didn't have a choice.
And you can read about that where?
I got that in through some of the Tennessee Civil War battle orders. And so I can send them to Linda and she can make sure.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
It's available online?
It is. Through Tennessee Source Book.
Okay.
And Civil War Source Book. And you can look at some of the battle orders and things like that. And so,
wonderful.
And I got it from when I was at McClung in Knoxville, which is the East Tennessee Historical Building.
He
so.
spent the morning.
Okay, good. The reason you have to put your mind in an 1860s mindset or 1850s mindset, and what you have to think is that there's no lake, so there's just two rivers, and so the reason why this was ground zero for the Union and Confederate armies in the 1860s is because there's two rivers that run parallel to Knoxville, and so this was the corridor in which all fighting must have taken place. The problem with the South is that they were locked between the two rivers, and so was the Union Army. The South's Army in December and January had no shoes. A lot of them didn't have shoes. That's not a rumor that there were Southern boys and went to battle with bare feet. They didn't. They had blankets wrapped around there. General Longstreet talks about in one of his orders that they would be on the offensive, but they have no food and they have no shoes. And so his boys couldn't march. Then they said because of the two rivers, they were landlocked, that they could send the cavalry outside of it and they could go get supplies and forage. But if they went outside to go forage, they couldn't do that because it would take too much for the horses to ride to go get to the forage, and so and they couldn't bring it back, and so they were locked in, and they were begging. Longstreet sent request after request after request. Please, 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 give us food, give us shoes. They were trying to make their own shoes, and they couldn't do that. So, I mean, they would make 100 pairs.
Did they have shoes before the war?
They didn't have the industry to when they wore out, and they walked everywhere. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, so Longstreet was stuck in the spots he was stuck in, fighting a defensive campaign, even though he outnumbered the Union forces because he didn't have food to march his army on, and he didn't have shoes to march his army on. They said that it was so cold. There's an account of an Indiana soldier after the Battle of Mossy Creek that it was so cold that some of the wounded froze to death in the field because it was almost 15 below on the 30th and 31st. And so that's why they were burning homes and they were burning everything that they could get their hand on. The college was damaged. It had about $6,000, I think it was between $4,000 and $6,000 worth of damage in the contemporary time, which is, if you use them, if you look for try and figure out money, if you go back to 1900 from today, it's 27 is the multiplier. Mm-hmm. So 1,000 would be the equivalent of $27,000. So, looking at that, you're looking at the couple $100,000 worth of damage that was done. The college did not receive that money to almost 1900.
Yeah.
From the federal government.
1903, I think. Yeah.
That we received a grant. Did you know we received a grant from J.D. Rockefeller for $15,000? That his only stipulation was that if the college raised $50,000 more, that he would give $15,000. Well, back then that's like $400,000, $500,000. So he gave the college that much money, and that along with that money from the federal government was enough to pull the college to where they could start building building some dorms and things like that.
All right, now you're telling us about what again?
First Tennessee Cavalry.
Okay.
It's a pro-Union cavalry unit that fought for the Union Army. A lot of the men that were in that were from East Tennessee and Knoxville, and including Mossy Creek and Talbot and everything else. They fought, and they had fought in Kentucky. They were stationed in Ohio for a little bit. They went to Louisville. They fought at Nashville. They fought on their way down in Tullahoma. They went into Georgia and were part of Sherman's army. Well, they fought here at Mossy Creek. They were stationed, and they led the cavalry charge that broke up the Confederate attack. One of the captains that led the charge, the Sabre Charge, was a man by the name of E.J. Cannon. E.J. Cannon grew up 4 miles from here in Talbot Station, and he led the charge, was shot died 2 days later from his wounds, and died here just 4 miles from his home in the Battle of Mossy Creek.
Wow.
And unfortunately for him, and the Branner Cemetery, which is over by Glenmore, they put on his grave marker, he died January 1st, 1864, but like we do with checks and things, they put January 1st, 1863 on his grave marker because they put the wrong date down. And so,
Gotcha.
and so this is, so that was it. The original Mossy Creek, that if you even go back to the Peck family, so you're talking about 1820s, 1830s, was all along this creek.
Or 1790 is
even 1790s.
got
but
here.
The industry was here. This is where, and it went all the way out to the mill where the Peck mill was, and then Fain's mill and everything else. But this is the early part of the creek. The mouth of the creek is less than a mile over here. It's at a water treatment plant.
Okay.
And so this was it. In my research, I found in 1873 there was as many as 12 different mills and lumber mills all along this creek at one point or another.
And that was because it just had steady flow, and they were able to use that to run their.
It had enough power, and they said one of the things that was important about it, and I read in a contemporary account, that every 400 meters or 400 yards about the creek would drop between 8 to 12 feet. So there was enough power and waterfalls that you could run a wheel, and you could run a mill, and you could run a cotton mill, and you could run
a grease mill, a grist mill.
Yeah, a grist mill, and that was over there by at the edge of this property. And so there was just so much water and everything else that went through here, water power, that this was it. This is where the industry started. And in fact, where the gravel road is right here, it was a railroad line that went to the zinc mine. In the 1850s, they realized that there was that zinc was in abundance at Mossy Creek.
Okay.
A New York company came in 1858, tried to open zinc mining operations here at Mossy Creek. Well, New York, 1858, by 1860, as the war was looking like it was going to happen more and more, they realized that there was no way that they could open a healthy operation and be successful, because the war looked like it was closer and closer, especially with the election then of Abraham Lincoln. They made it really almost impossible. And so they closed operations. The Port Zinc operation ran here about 6 or 7 times, and closed after about 2 years each time, because they could get to the oxidized zinc, which was the surface zinc that was softer, and they would make what was called zinc flour. And then zinc is used for copper. It was used for copper fittings. It was used for everything. But they couldn't get to the sulfide zinc, which was the harder stuff. They didn't have the equipment to crush it to make that same zinc flour. So they could only get surface digging. So if you went down to the end of the property here, you can see where the original zinc mine was, and where they scratched out and dug, because they just couldn't get to that. And so in 1870, Mossy Creek was the 13th biggest city in the state of Tennessee. It had 2,000 citizens in 1870. In 1870, Knoxville had, and just in relevance, had only 8,000 people. So we were a quarter as big as Knoxville. Nashville had about 40,000, or Nashville had 20, and Memphis had 40,000. So we were, and Chattanooga had like 5. And so we were as big, as far as cities go, we were a mid-range city in the state of Tennessee. And so it had importance, and it was equally divided in the Civil War, because a lot of pro-Union men existed in this part of the country. In fact, everything from Knoxville up almost stayed in the Union because of the strength of Andrew Johnson, because Andrew Johnson was a Union man, and East Tennessee was Union. It had been Whig, so it was not Democrat. It wasn't for Andrew Jackson like the rest of the state was. It was a Democrat. I mean, it was a Whig, because it was poor middle-class farmers that didn't own a lot of slaves, that were here working or owned none, and were able to and had to run it and work here. So they were Whigs, and they were frontiersmen, and they loved the American flag, and they were much more loyal to the national cause than they were to the state cause. And so a lot of them stayed as part of the Union and didn't leave. In fact, there were almost 30,000, they said, volunteers from the Union in this part of the country.
Wow.
So out of 45,000 eligible men, 30,000 volunteers. So we're below Glenville. So.
Okay, and yeah, we're down on the edge of, that's still Mossy Creek down there?
Mossy Creek flowing through here.
Okay, and then you said, look over here, this is where Glenmore was?
Glenmore is
way up
those
there.
Trees. Yeah, up there on the hill.
Okay, gotcha, we've been up there.
There's a quarry over here that was some of the ground that they used as a field and everything. It's a wet quarry now, and it wasn't at one point. They did for the zinc mine and everything else. We think the original zinc mine was a surface mine, and it was right here in this spot. Over here in the grove of trees also is probably where, we don't know that for certain, but we're pretty certain that the original Mossy Creek Baptist Church was, where the original college went. We know that was some of the property. This was the zinc mine. If we go kind of where that house is through here and we keep going in a straight line for about another not even quarter mile, probably another 200, 300 feet, is where the creek comes in and bends and heads back towards the town of Jefferson City, which was Mossy Creek at that time.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the creek bent. There was a significant drop there, and that was where the biggest mill was, that went all the way up to the 1960s. That was right there. So that when people see pictures and if you see lithographs of this area, this is open area. So the fact that there's trees here, there were none at that point. Okay. Maybe during the Civil War there was, but we know that this open area right here was probably the industry hub of this part of Mossy Creek. In fact, back through here was just a huge forest, no homes, some farm field, and they used to call it, in good East Tennessee terms, Sawmill Holler.
Okay.
And so there was a sawmill or two that were along this way, and then so they would bring them down and use the creek water to do that. All this dirt that's been pushed and moved was from the mine, that they pushed it and moved it back and forth, that this didn't exist. We think that there was probably an old bridge right there at one point or another.
Mm-hmm.
We found some Civil War era artifacts, medicine bottles and things that we think that probably there was even a field hospital set up during the Civil War right in that area of the creek right there, because they wanted to be near clean water, and okay. We found some Civil War era bottles and things like that from over there in our research. But we know that this is probably where the mine was. Mm-hmm. We think that's an old rock crusher. We're not certain, but we think that was one in the 1900 version of the mine. They finally had a rock crusher. It's reinforced concrete, which probably dates itself a little bit later, but at some point or another, the rock crusher was right there. The Baptist church was right there. The mill was over this way, and so this was kind of the industrial road for town. This is where a little bit more of the industry was that would go through. The original building, the original post office, besides Peck's Mill, and where the blockhouse and where they stayed was, we know that Haynes Iron Works was the original building for the town. That later became the post office for Mossy Creek, and we think that was probably right over here too.
Cool.
So we're the original center of town. If you look, even the old road that goes through town right now, that wasn't the main road. The main road was what they call Depot Street, and that hooked up with the road that went parallel to the train to Knoxville and into Morristown. The reason why this area would be significant during the Civil War was you had the road coming in from Dandridge, the road to Morristown, the road to Knoxville, and Chucky Pike, which went out to White Pine and went that way. And so all those roads converged. So this was the important crossroad, plus the railroad.
Plus the railroad, right?
Plus the railroad. And then the stage road that ran out along the Holston River and went the kind of backwards way to Morristown, because there was a water route. It was better to water the horses. So all of those roads kind of converged right here. We know that one of the Indiana regiments and Michigan regiments were stationed like right here. This is where they were.
And there's a lot of accounts of Isham and his wife Emma traveling by stage and by steamboat, I think down the Holston, all the way down to Louisiana. I mean, obviously they had to stop at certain points. They'd stage from one place to the next place. They get another steamboat, head down. But
they talk about a lot of times that they would take their goods down the Holston on a flatboat, and they would take flatboats, and there would be people. They talked about the Fanes and different people like that would take their goods by flatboat from Mossy Creek to Knoxville to sell in some of the bigger markets, and Market Square, which is, downtown where you were today. That's where they would go down there.
And your definition of a flatboat, basically like a small barge.
A small barge,
basically, and I think that's what they say Adam and Elizabeth originally came in on, right? Back in the late 1700s.
Pole driven, that would be you know, that you may have a sail, but you know, it wasn't.
Okay.
It was, you were close to the water, and you would take a stick and you put it in the ground. And
Wow.
you go a little bit further and you try and propel yourself, because you may have a sail on it, but you can't guarantee in wind, and you just kind of went with the flow of the water.
Wow.
As you went. And so because Knoxville was downriver, it was easier to go that way. On the way back, it was a lot more difficult.